Good evening. I'm McKenna Beers.
And I'm Zach Carr, reporting to you with the latest and hottest news on China's current platform with global climate change.
Recently, China and many other countries have been battling with the controversy of global warming. In hopes of lowering the rate of CO2 emissions and slowing the increase of Earth's temperature, non-Annex 1, Annex 1, and Annex 2 countries have been working together in the UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol to make a change for our current and future well-being.
First, we'd like to take you to the beginning and tell you about the opportunities and vulnerabilities that come along with the changes in climate. One vulnerability that China is facing is the loss of biodiversity, particularly in the coral reefs. The rising sea levels and increased urbanization, as well as the industrialization, is causing a significant decrease in the amount of coral reefs. The increase in carbon emissions causes coral bleaching, which is damaging to the ecosystems living in reefs areas, resulting in a shortage for fish and food. This vulnerability impacts China ecologically with the coral reefs and economically because the seafood would be more expensive due to the shortage. Another vulnerability that China is facing is the decrease in water supply from rivers. Increase of extreme heat waves leads to an increase in the cost of water along with the shortage of water for hydropower machines, so the people who live along the river will be affected a lot. This vulnerability also has economic and ecological effects. The economy will be affected because of the higher water costs, and the ecological aspect is that there is less water for fish and other animals. China is also facing a couple of opportunities, one of them being developing a new renewable company for oil that creates more jobs and a better market for China. Due to a rise in temperature, it is causing an increase in extreme weather, which makes the government raise the price of oil and feel the need to control the exhaust emissions. Oil consumers are exposed most to this. This opportunity has ecological dimension with the big impact on water and temperatures, and an economic dimension due to the growth of new energy companies. In addition, it has social dimensions because government policy also influences the price. Another opportunity that China is facing is air measure device companies benefits from air pollution. Air pollution has become more serious throughout the past couple of years, which results in a big impact on the human ordinary life. Residents in serious polluted areas, and for example, residents of Beijing are exposed most to this. This air pollution is harming the environment, but has created a lot of chances for some certain industries and companies who produce air measure devices to thrive off of this. Therefore, this opportunity included both economic and ecological dimensions.
Another vulnerability has to do with severe droughts. Consumers and households will be affected by the increased price by lowering the income take of wheat in families. The domestic wheat prices rose up around 10% year on year. This vulnerability has an economic dimension by having the price increase and also ecological dimension because the land is affected by the severe drought. One opportunity that comes off of a vulnerability is the carbon dioxide emissions increasing the global warming effect and air pollution. Because it's a problem, the Chinese government promotes improvement of efficient energy technology and energy-saving products. Then, that way, the Chinese people will save money and have a better environment for the present and future. Another opportunity is increase in rainfall and a vulnerability with disease because of the changes in air and water quality. Global warming theories have caused countries to take an active role in minimizing global warming effects, which brings up the debate on constructions of dams in a major river in southwest China called the New River. Due to an increase in rainfall from global warming, the amount of flooding in rivers have increased in China. So, they're thinking about building dams. But if the dams were to be built, Chinese geologists are worried that they could potentially trigger earthquakes, being that the New River is located in one of the most seismically active areas in the country. It would also destroy over 3,500 plant species and 8 endangered animals. So, the ecological change would be hydropower. Hydropower is a renewable resource of electricity which is friendly to the environment. So, with that being said, building dams in the river will reduce CO2 emissions up to 40 to 45% from levels in 2005. Building 13 proposed dams for the New River will help with irrigation, recreation, hydroelectric power, and of course, flood control.
Next, we'd like to turn it over to Jacob in Hantao in Shanghai.
Thank you, McKenna. I'm Jacob,
I'm Han Tao.
and now we're going to tell you about before and after the industrialization of China.
China didn't develop much during the industrialization because they separated the country from the outside, which resulted in a big leap of national power between China and Western countries. And eventually, China became semi-colony. China finally got a chance to develop at a rapid rate in recent several decades. Before the industrialization, China mostly used coal, but evidence shows that their overall burning of fossil fuel increased nearly triple since 1990. As a result, huge pollution and exhaust emissions were generated. Right now, China is responsible for more than 20% of all carbon dioxide emissions. Of course, oil burning is not the only reason for such a huge exhaust emissions, but also the deforestation contributed a lot. As the world's second largest consumer and importer of wood products, overall deforestation leads to large decrease in carbon dioxide options of forests.
There are many different lifestyles in China, with the average annual income being 4,000 US dollars and 28,000 Chinese yen. Within those lifestyles, there's people that can afford more expensive transportation, such as the private cars versus public transportation. And with those private cars, in the long run, you're going to create more emissions. With the city population, you'll end up using a lot more electricity and having a larger carbon footprint. And the average carbon footprint in China is 6.2. With vulnerable populations, there is the category of women. A lot of the women in the world, especially those living in the developed countries, unfortunately do not have the same opportunities as many of the men do, and they're not politically or religiously viewed as important. And while men are able to pack up and move to places that are a lot more green, women at times are stuck behind and have to deal with the devastation caused by the deforestation, the drought, crop failures, and other conditions. They're very dependent on the natural resources, such as the land and the forest, that when that is depleted, they really don't have much to go off of. Many of the poor people live in rural areas and have jobs that depend on agriculture to make their livings. And without a lot of money, and if there's a natural disaster, they face the risk of starvation and their revenue being dropped and not having the money to recover. Indigenous people's lives are dependent on good weather, and with the bad weather that's been happening, they're having a struggle to adapt and survive. And most of the problems that many of the tribal members are facing is a food crisis, and their homes are being destroyed. The young and old, children are tremendously affected by global warming. They're most vulnerable to the resulting health risk and will be exposed longer to the health consequences. The elderly are the ones that usually have a higher risk of catching the disease, passing out from heat waves, and not having a great immune system, and a lot of pre-existing medical conditions, and not being able to fight off diseases. 5 important trade-offs for China would be climate finance, climate diplomacy, decrease in oil prices, jobs, and agriculture. And a trade-off is a balance achieved between two desirable but incompatible features, and it's a compromise. Many countries like China will have to make the decision to choose one thing over another based on what the country thinks is best for the land of the majority of the people. Yes, not everyone will agree, and it can stir up a lot of political, economical, and demographical controversy, but China needs to look at it as a whole. Many things need to be taken into consideration, and although some decisions may not seem like the best short-term decisions, in the long run, they could be very beneficial.
Now we are going to send you over to our final new cast members to give you the scope on our interaction with the UNFCCC.
Thank you, Han Tao. I'm Xiang Zhou.
And I'm Shu Yanzhang.
Speaking of the industrialization, we are going to turn the pages to China's environment and how the industrialization has affected.
China is a part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and takes great pride in its involvement. For the history of China's involvement, China accepted and signed the UNFCCC agreements on January 5, 1993. The agreement was put into action on March 21, 1998, and China was a non-Annex I country because they are still developing. And in 1997, Kyoto Protocol stated that China was a developing country and that developing countries were not obligated to substantially reduce emissions. In 2009, China's emissions have raised so much, so they submitted an agreement said they will reduce emissions by 40 to 45% by 2020. For the agriculture, scientists have concerned that China will not be able to feed itself in the future due to a reduction of land. Being a non-Annex I country, China does not need to reduce gas emissions by a specific date, although they have participated a great deal because it will help with natural disasters killing their crops. They also taking actions. Like in 2007 and 2008, the Chinese government signed agreements with Norway in NGO to assess potential risks caused by climate change and develop ways to respond. For controlling CO2 emissions, on December 9th, Chinese government representatives are attending COP20 said that China will control carbon dioxide emissions under 10 billion tons during 2016 to 2020 each year. And the history of that, as the second largest oil importer in the world, China's overall burning of fossil fuels has rapidly increased since the Industrial Revolution. By 2014, China was responsible for more than 20% of all CO2 emissions, which is more than any other country in the world.
China makes a new policy for the UFCCC and the Kyoto named China's Policy and Action in 2014. They want to reduce pollution and carbon emission by adjusting the industry structure from traditional industry to service industry. First, they want to promote the transformation and upgrade traditional industry, accelerate the elimination of background production capacity. They want to boost the development of strategic emerging industries. Last, they want to invest developing the service industry. China is the second most carbon dioxide exhausting country. In 1997, Kyoto Protocol stated that China was a developing country and that developing countries were not obligated to substantially reduce emissions. After a couple years went by where China was able to recover and be more financially and economically steady, China promised to start taking responsibility for climate change in October 2002. In 2009, China's emissions had raised so much that they submitted an agreement that required them to reduce emissions 40 to 45% by 2020. If they didn't, China emission would reach the maximum, which is expected to be about 15 billion tons in 2030. For reducing the carbon dioxide and pollution, China started to convert their traditional energy like coal, oil to solar energy. In 2014, solar power raised 6% as coal production for 64.2%. China is starting its solar power production 20% higher than its original goal in 2015. 6% higher than the solar generation of 2014. They plan to raise solar power capacity to 16.8 GW in 2015, with an original goal of 15 GW. They have set their goal higher for stabilization in solar application market. Solar energy is a renewable source of energy and helps to reduce the amount of emission and creates a green environment. China is focusing on building more rooftop plants and small scale. Back to McKenna and Zach in Beijing.
Thanks, Jang. We're back to talk with you about China's recommendation for all other countries involved in the UNFCCC to put a halt to global climate change. With China's efforts to reduce emissions by developing at a slower rate, we expect all other developing countries to join us. Countries will still be able to develop and progress as needed, but at a rate that will show changes in greenhouse gas and carbon dioxide emissions. Developed countries are responsible for a majority of financial aid, with developing covering the rest. By giving the non-developed countries financial aid, it will allow them to adapt more easily to global climate change. We want countries to focus on advocating to future generations about simple ways to help and reduce the impacts of global climate change, and use the current generation to change more complicated ways. A few benefits and costs of our UNFCCC proposal are as follows. The first benefit is that all developing countries would still be able to develop at a new rate that would help improve on global climate change. A cost of this is that developed countries are large emitters and there is no guidelines pertaining to their emissions. Another benefit is that we have created a system to place financial burden upon countries based on their financial stability and level of being developed or not. The cost of this is that some countries may have not noted finances or finances that aren't recorded due to our negligence and may be able to afford their financial portions. Another benefit is that non-developed countries are the future of our world and we have decided to invest in them to be sure that they are able to develop in the future with integrity and with global climate change in mind. A cost of this is that some non-developed countries may not have their technology and resources to use their money, and many developed or developing countries could use funds to be able to help correct the global problems we have created. As China, we have created our recommendation with our own country in mind and with thoughts of ways to help our country first while helping those who need help next. A cost of this is that we may have put too much thought into our own country rather than our world. We may want to reconsider the countries who need to emit less. It's best to look at our current and future generations when discussing large climate changes. Social analysis. Most of the people would like to do easy things to make our world better for our future, such as taking more public transportation, riding bikes, and recycling. However, not all people would like to make these changes. Some people prefer the luxurious life and do not care about the waste. Most of the companies and businesses try to reduce carbon emission through improving the equipment or changing the structure of productions, while other companies still produce great pollution and carbon emissions looking for the highest profits. Governments should take more responsibilities to propagate and lead the public, also supervise the companies with great pollution and carbon emissions.
The Intergen game demonstrated the concept that previous generations have a huge impact on future ones. A country has a choice whether they want to max out production for immediate results. This makes it tough for future generations to succeed. The country could also decide to invest in technology. Even though this doesn't provide immediate results to the country, it will help future generations to succeed. In the TEG game, we learned that if all countries were to think for themselves and do something that would only benefit their own country, in the long run, none of the countries would really benefit from those actions. It's all about coming together and working for a greater common goal, which means that some countries make sacrifices so they can develop and reduce CO2 emissions for future generations. The theory of justice. Developed countries could refuse to cooperate and help developing countries, but we all live on this planet together, which means we'll all have responsibilities to protect what we are depending on to live. Therefore, we came up with a fair recommendation in our proposal. Our recommendation, although some may disagree, is pretty fair for the most part. Both developed and developing countries are able to be better off with our plan because it does not hurt Annex 1 countries while we help non-Annex 1 countries develop and grow economically. 3 groups that are vulnerable to climate change include women, indigenous people, and the old. For indigenous people, we need to establish an independent area with modern facilities which is stronger against climate changes than their own habitat. In case of severe change in the climate, we can protect them, but also keep their own ways of life to maximum degree. The old. They're the most sensitive group of people to the climate change. Any tiny improvement by reducing the industry pollution output means a lot to them. We also should arrange part of our financial aid to enhance their ability of escaping from heavy pollution, such as relocating the nursing homes to cleaner areas or upgrading the facilities to reduce the pollution from outside.
Thanks for joining us. See you next time.